What I'm sometimes saying to them is, you don't need to leave. You just need to do two things. You need to acknowledge that you're not brilliant at everything, and you need to bring in a team around you who have the skill set and the experience that you don't. But what's absolutely critical is that at that point, you actually let them do the job.
Welcome to the Startup CEO Succession podcast, where we dive deep into the pivotal journey of founder CEOs who face the critical decision. Should you continue leading your business or bring in a new leader? I'm your host, Evgeny. As a founder coach and author specializing in CEO succession, I interview founders, chief executives, and investors who share their stories of navigating this transition. Today, I'm speaking with Matt Colebourne, a seasoned entrepreneur with over 30 years of experience. From starting and selling an AI company in mid-90s, all the way to turning around and exiting 5 other companies since. Matt specializes in being a professional CEO who is brought in to either turn around a struggling company or scale and exit a successful business. In our conversation, we discuss the importance of self-awareness and soft skills when it comes to leading the team, as well as many practical challenges inherent in growing and scaling technology businesses. Enjoy the conversation. Hello, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for the introduction. I'm happy to be here.
You've got so much experience that I'm even at a loss how to briefly introduce you, because you've done so much over the last, I imagine, over 30 years. You've had a long career so far, and it's not over yet. Let's start with a brief overview of just your business history to give our listeners some context.
Oh boy. So you are going to ask me to go back into ancient history. So I started as a developer with the intention to move into commercial, moved into traditional software sales with a then very large outsourcing company, and then started my journey with smaller businesses with an AI company in the mid-90s. That was my first exit. Subsequent to that, I went into business intelligence, was involved in a further acquisition, but in this case being bought. After that, spending 3 years in Asia with that startup, then came back, moving into business intelligence, hypercubes, data processing, all of that kind of thing. And then for me, the big switch was joining what was then a pretty small company called DoubleClick. That was the start of the internet advertising wave, the first wave, when people were still going, banners on websites? Is that a business? Internet advertising? What's that? Why would you do that? And obviously we then saw 6-7 years of, I wouldn't call it growth even, I'd call it explosion. And then ultimately, as I think probably most people would know, DoubleClick was sold to Google for $3 and a bit billion after a pretty wild ride. And the technologies, I believe, albeit massively updated now, still being used for their display network. Then I went into PPC, pay-per-click, internet advertising, did a turnaround and sale of the last big European player. And subsequent to that, stayed in SaaS technology businesses in a range of verticals, all of them focused on delivery of technology and commercial arrangements associated with SaaS. And of late, I've ended up being more of a professional CEO that comes in either to drive scale-up stage of a business or to do a turnaround of a business that perhaps has grown up to a certain point and has then reached a plateau or is even starting to go back down again because it's struggling to take the next stage of existence. So yeah, 6 exits of varying sizes from a few billion down to a few million of different sized businesses, all in the technology space. I did a computer science degree, but I haven't completely forgotten it. So I still write VBA and app script in business models, but that's about the only technology I get to do these days.
Yeah. And you built a business and sold it in the AI space in the mid-90s.
Yes.
Before AI was cool, before all the latest technology, and before non-computer science people learned that AI exists. And that's an achievement.
Well, I can't really take too much credit in that I was on the commercial side by then. So, yes, absolutely. But I was focused on building relationships with clients. People were using the technology at the time to decide where to put superstores, to improve the gains curve on sending out catalogs, would you believe? And you know, we had a lot of success. I remember we were training some deep learning neural networks to forecast what the revenue per square meter would be based on where a very large company chose to put its superstores. And the results were surprisingly accurate. But going back then, I mean, you're talking mid 90s, the processing power that you required in order to train up a neural net model, so a deep learning model, I mean, you literally let it go for a few days before you would see any good outcome. So if you made any mistakes with your data sets then, you'd wasted a lot of time and effort.
Yep, those were the days. Definitely, yeah, a lot has changed. And by the way, looking at your LinkedIn profile earlier, I realized that we both studied computer science at Imperial and both went into business. So when I saw it, I thought, oh wow, we went into literally the same building in South Kensington.
Yep.
Yeah.
Were you there when they managed to misplace the thermostat in the computer room? I've never forgotten that. Somebody they installed the
What's
air
the story?
conditioning and put the thermostat in direct sunlight accidentally, so it was always hot. The aircon in the computer room was always running at full pelt. It was a hot summer, and all of us in Comp Sci that year, we had ski wear in our lockers because we would literally go in with fingerless gloves and puffer jackets. It was just so freezing in the computer room.
Well, they definitely fixed it by the time I got enrolled.
Oh, good, good. No, they did. I mean, they did fix it before I left, but yeah, we had one summer of getting absolutely frozen, and everybody had colds.
Well, it makes for a good story.
It does.
But Matt, out of everything you've done in your career, I'm really curious about two companies that you've been involved with in the last few years, because
Yep.
I know that there are a few really interesting CEO succession stories to tell. One of them is Searchmetrics, and the other is Qwist.
For
Which
sure.
one would be most interesting to start with?
They were quite different. The Searchmetrics story was a business that had grown extremely quickly, ran into a couple of issues, was then in a sort of gentle decline. The founder and the board had fallen out. I, if you like, picked up the pieces and turned that business around and sold it. The Qwist story is a little different. So the Qwist story was actually two businesses in the open finance space with very different profiles, very different leadership. But again, one of them was a founder, one of them was not. So we had a situation that the businesses look very different. So if you want a more complex situation, the Qwist one is probably the one to talk about. Searchmetrics was more about, I wasn't involved in the decision to exit the previous founding CEO. That was a board decision. I mean, speaking candidly, it was an uncomfortable situation because the founder was extremely charismatic and was an acknowledged expert in his field. I think it was a classic situation of somebody who was genuinely brilliant, but struggled with certain aspects of the CEO role. The business definitely struggled a little bit without him because somebody who was that into what they were doing and that focused on the product and passionate about what needed to be in that product, that was a massive strength. And obviously going from a situation where you've got somebody who is driving forward the vision of what the product and what the services should be, and suddenly you take that person out, and then you bring in somebody who is a bit more of a generalist, they call me a professional CEO, if you like, who knows how to build a business, knows how to scale a business, but with the best one in the world, never had the same depth of expertise in the product, and therefore essentially handed it over to a chief product officer. And the dynamic then between the founder was still involved in the business, and we had a pretty good working relationship. But the relationship with the new CPO was fiery because both individuals had strong views as to where the product needed to go.
And Matt, could you help me understand the context? What were the reasons the board decided to ask the founder CEO to step down?
Yes, it was fundamentally fairly classic situation where whilst the individual was hugely capable and inspirational in some senses, the management side, the people management, the alignment of the team, the understanding of how product and engineering needed to work with the commercial team, all of that was creating massive disruption within the business that was therefore generating a lot of problems. And the business had plateaued. In fact, it had worse than plateaued. It had plateaued and then started to come down again. Most of that was down to, well, it was down to a mix of factors. And that was actually the problem, in that I think the founder had the strong belief that if we build it, they will come. If I build the best product, that's going to solve all problems. In actual fact, the board said, no, it's not. This is now a maturing market. As you go into a maturing market, it's no longer just about the product. It's about the complete value proposition. It's how you go out to the market. It's how you support clients. It's how you contract with them. All of those things start having a much bigger impact than when you're in the early days, when it's all about the product. Which is the best product? Oh, this is great. This is new. This adds value. As markets mature, of course, there's competitors. The best solution is not always necessarily the best technical solution. Sometimes it's the mix of the services that you bundle around it. It's make sure that somebody can actually use that. I think that really was where there was some tension, and that was where the business started to struggle. We're talking about SEO in this instance. The founder was going, okay, well, I'm going to build a better and more sophisticated product for experts, for people like me. But the market is starting to say, well, this is an important part of the marketing mix. Therefore, we're going to have SEO teams within corporate marketing departments. Those people probably don't have anything like the same level of expertise. They need to create value in a much simpler and easier way, and they don't need some of the bells and whistles. The technology needs to have its VCR to digital recorder moment where you get more sophisticated, but it becomes harder to use the product. And somebody says, no, actually what we do is we start building more intelligence into the product to make the end user experience simpler. And then maybe you also focus, instead of just on the product itself, you start looking at, well, how are you going to support that client with professional services, with training? Can you actually provide some degree of service to go with the product? That means the end customer is getting their goals better satisfied. So that classic switch is sometimes tricky. So that was one of the big issues, that the market for real super hardcore experts was not as large as the market for marketing departments that go, hey, we should be including SEO as part of our marketing mix. It was very much that transition.
Yeah. So it sounds like there are two transitions here. One is the transition from a small, very focused niche product for early adopters.
Yes.
And moving it to a larger market for people who are not early adopters, for the mainstream market.
Yep.
So that's one transition. And the other seems to be from the founder skill set, someone who knows how to go from an idea to something that works, to a professional CEO skill set who can take something that works and turn it into a functioning company.
I think with the best will in the world, I don't think any CEO, and I would include myself in that, has got all the answers in all the departments and all the functions. I often say business is the ultimate team game, and I really do believe that. You put together a team that, as a whole, is able to do what needs to be done. I think I've actually, in several instances, sort of advised founders who say, oh, I'm going to have to leave the business because, I'm this, I've got the business to this point, and now wouldn't it be better if somebody else takes over? On a few occasions, I said, well, no, absolutely not. What you bring is massively valuable as long as you acknowledge that maybe if you're a commercial CEO, you need to bring in technology experts. If you're a more product-oriented CEO, you need to bring in commercial support. The key thing is you need to let those people execute. And that's really, for me, the key thing. I don't think founders necessarily need to hand over to a quote unquote professional CEO, because you do always lose something a little bit when you do that. You lose some of that passion, that grit that a founder has to have to say, okay, I believe in this. Other people are cynical, other people don't really see it, but I'm just going to make it happen. Sometimes those people go, no, I need to leave. Whereas actually what I'm sometimes saying to them is, you don't need to leave. You just need to do two things. You need to acknowledge that you're not brilliant at everything, and you need to bring in a team around you who have the skill set and the experience that you don't. But what's absolutely critical is that at that point, you actually let them do the job. And that's where I think sometimes it goes wrong. And that's why sometimes founders do need to exit, because they just can't let go. They can't say, okay, you know what? There is no way this business is reaching a certain scale at which I don't know everything that's going on. Stuff is happening all over the business, and there's no way that it's possible even to keep track of everything. But that's fine. I've got the right people in place at the right levels and with the right skills to make it all happen. And I'm going to look at building my top level team and making sure that I pull that team together, but that I really give people a genuine opportunity to make the business better. So I think for me, it's very much, you can easily go from founder to scale up to large scale operation, as long as you're open enough to bring in the skill set that you need to support the areas that you can't really handle as an individual.
Yeah. So it sounds like there are two possible scenarios here as the company grows. In some cases, the right thing to do is for the founder to step down but remain involved, as happened at Searchmetrics.
Yep.
So the company tried to retain what good stuff the founder was bringing to the table.
Yep.
But in other situations, the founder complements their skill set, because, as you've said, no one can do everything perfectly well, and they need to let go, delegate, trust, and lead a team of executives that then lead the business.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But
how do you see the difference? What's the right approach when?
well, I'm not sure that I can give a sort of panacea that says, if this, then that, then you go this way. I think it very much comes down to individuals and also the nature of the market. So, for example, going back to the DoubleClick days, we went from being a single product company to then having, I think, 17 products. That created a very different organization, and the skills needed to navigate that and make it successful were very different. The founders were still involved, but there was a huge degree of autonomy for the leadership in the executive team to make stuff happen, because the organization had outgrown that single product focus. So for me, it's very hard, because you've got to look at the individual, the market, the product set, and you've got to look at the other people within the organization. Are they able to perform? And are they motivated to perform? And is there an environment in which they have what they need to perform? If we go back to what skill set does the CEO have, I would say, if you're like a professional CEO, right, is somebody who has got, as I said, nobody's brilliant at everything, but at least they have got a clear understanding of all the key functions and what good looks like. Maybe they can't do it themselves, but they understand what good looks like. And so what they can do is build that team or develop that team into something that works, right? So despite doing a computer science degree, it was so long ago, I wouldn't dream of talking to my CTPO and saying, Rory, right, use this technology, build it this way, right? I'm not going to go there. but I absolutely know what looks good in terms of uptime, roadmap delivery, innovation, all of those things. So I can have a conversation that says, well, the budget needs to be this looks reasonable, this kind of development in terms of the product set and how it fits to the market. But, I'm never going to get involved in any kind of detail. That's what a professional CEO brings you, somebody who's got an understanding of what good looks like in most of the functions of a business, and therefore can hopefully build pretty much like a top sports coach can go, right, well, I need that individual to look after product and engineering. I need that person to look after infrastructure. I need this in my finance team. I need this in sales. I need this in customer success or account management. So that's, I would say, was the professional CEO. You can do that. And that's probably the key skill set. But you've got to be really careful that you don't lose the passion. I think we've all seen businesses where the founder leaves because maybe they've been told by the investors, hey, we've got product market fit, we've got a few customers, now it's all about scaling. And then you lose the fire if you're not careful. For me, it's always a nuanced decision. It very much depends on the situation. Sometimes it makes sense that the founder CEO stays. Sometimes it makes sense that they stay but are no longer the CEO. Sometimes it makes sense that they stay as CEO but bring in people around them. And sometimes it does make sense that no, you bring in somebody different and they take the business forward. But all of those, I don't think there is a inevitability to any of those outcomes. It's very much dependent on the individual and how they develop. I've known founder CEOs who've, I think, we can all see it, heads of some very large companies who've absolutely done the whole journey and got to the point of running very large organizations very successfully. On the other hand, we've seen, founder CEOs who've moved into saying, hey, I'm really about the product. So you know what? I'm just going to be CPO and I'll let somebody else take over the other functions in the business. And then you've seen others who just can't let go. And at some point, the board says, well, you've created some great value, but the next step is probably going to be without you. I don't think there's an inevitability to any of those.
Yeah. It's almost like if you don't let go yourself, we will make you let go for you.
Yeah.
So, Matt, if we go back to the story of Searchmetrics, you joined the business as a professional CEO.
Yes.
The founder CEO stayed inside the business, and your job was to make sure that the company starts growing again while working with the board, founder, ex-CEO, and you also brought in some external talent. What happened next?
So what happened next was I didn't bring in that much external talent. We hired into the engineering and product side. And over time, the founder did move away from the business, but that was more his decision than ours. What we just did was look at what was getting in the way of the business not growing. One of the things was that fundamental realization of looking and saying, hang on a minute, we are building a product that's only good for experts. And then we've got a sales team that is selling it in some cases to small businesses. And those small businesses are struggling to use the product. So it was very much a product market fit issue. Was sales selling the right product to the right people? Frequently the answer was no, because the churn rate was relatively high and also the customer success workload was very high, because essentially we were selling a product to people that they were struggling to use. And whilst it was incredibly powerful, you really need to be an expert to use it. There weren't that many experts. So we did a whole bunch of things, but fundamentally what we did is spend time on understanding who's the customer at an individual level, not at a business level, because I think this is, again, the slightly cynical side of being a professional CEO is you understand the junior commercial individual or the salespeople assumes that the interests of the organization are the same as the interests of the people to whom they're selling. And yes, they are to a degree, but you've also got to understand there's an individual motivation. And once you start understanding that, which is how do you make your customer, the individual that's actually buying your product or service, successful within their organization, rather than just how do you make that organization hit its goals? Because those two things, if you can satisfy both, then you're onto a winner. So, we made changes to the way that we sold. We made it easier to buy. We made it easier to use the product. That was, a trickier one. But what we also did was start adding the extra services that people needed to be successful. So we started saying, you're buying a solution. You're not just buying a product and then we go, there you go, here's some training material, good luck. Instead, we actually started bundling services with the product to ensure that people were actually getting value. They were actually getting insights and then being told how they needed to actually deploy them within their businesses to create real value. It was one of those complex situations where actually you had to look at the product, the commercial operation, the pricing and packaging. You had to look at what did success really look like, because how experts look at success versus how more commercially minded people look at it is quite different. There were conversations that were slightly uncomfortable for the more technical SEO people, because they went, hang on a minute, you don't know your job. And, having to say to people, no, they do know their job. They're not at your level of expertise. They don't need to be. And actually, we need to make sure that we're taking a view that we make life easy for the client. And it's hard for an expert. It's hard for them to go, oh, right, no, I'm not going to add this amazing new feature that I've just thought of, because there's only going to be a handful of people that understand how to use it. And if you misuse it, then you just get yourself confused and lost and go, well, what's going on?
Yeah. So it sounds like the organization went through a shift away from let's build an incredible product, which is going to be technically amazing, towards who are our customers, what do they need, and does our product solve their problem?
Yeah. And I think this is a very common cycle in that, again, you think about it, probably most founders are more focused around product. Right? It's not always the case, but I would argue probably most. Right? It's, I've got a great idea. We could deliver this, and guess what? That would make life better. It would allow us to do something that hasn't been done before or solve a problem. But then the temptation is to stay focused on, okay, we just make it better and better and better, and that means we do better commercially. And instead of thinking about, well, no, as I said, as you prove value, more businesses will start adopting it. But as part of a more general mix, it stops being quite a specialist. If you go back, I'm showing my age here, when we went from internet display advertising to pay-per-click advertising, initially that was not really a specialism. Once it started scaling, people went, oh, well, I'll hand it over to the marketing department. And it was only when it got really big that people started specializing. And initially they were just agencies that would help marketing departments with this new channel. Now, now it's become so huge that you kind of go back almost to having specializations because it justifies it. But if you never become quite that scale, but you're a good scale, you have to fit within the part of the business that you're selling to. So if you're selling to a marketing team, you've got to make sure that the person that is actually going to be using your technology is the person that you're pitching it at, that you are not building for an individual that doesn't exist within most marketing teams, as an example. And I think you can go the other way, and here talking about the Qwist situation, where you get too hung up on the big picture and don't spend enough time on the nuts and bolts of the product and the nuts and bolts of how you sell it, how you price it, and how you contract for business. Right? We've all seen that, where you get these waves and people start talking about, well, this is huge. We are going to do insert big story here. And then you go, well, hang on, what about the detail? How are you going to deliver that? What are you going to sell that is actually going to deliver value? And people go, oh, well, we could do this or we could do this. And then you see organizations go wrong in that way. You see organizations go wrong where they get one big client early on, and that client almost starts viewing them as internal. Okay, they're going to build the product that I want. And because it's a big client and it's worth a massive amount, suddenly your product strategy is going off in the direction of solving for just this one big client instead of doing the tough work and going, well, what do we need to deliver so that we can actually be successful in a broader market? So there's so many. I mean, this is why business is fun.
Yes, so many different
There's
challenges.
so many different challenges and so many ways that you can go wrong. And I don't think you ever get it all right. Personally, I'm a petrol head. I used to be a racer. And as we always used to say, you never do the perfect lap. I don't think you ever find the perfect CEO, and you'll never find the perfect strategy, because everything changes all the time.
Yeah.
And you just have to have that preparedness to look at the facts and change. But at the same time, take people with you at a pace they can accept.
That's where the skill lies.
Yeah, I mean, it's...
Yeah. But Matt, before we get to the Qwist story,
Yeah.
I'm curious, what happened to Searchmetrics?
Yeah, no, we sold it. Essentially, we turned the business back around to growth, but then we realized with the way that market was growing, unless we made a massive investment to really broaden the offering and there were better funded competitors, we would do okay, but we were never going to get to where we wanted to be. So in the end, we sold that business to a much bigger US SEO company that didn't really have much in the way of a European operation. Success looked like understanding the limits of what could be achieved within the resources available. It's a tough one because, of course, you always want to win, but sometimes, a win looks a little bit different from what you first intended. And I think that was the case there, in that, initially we did think, hey, we're 20 million plus business, we can get to 50, and then realizing actually that's going to be tricky because there's other better funded players in the market who, fast as we bring in new business, they're stealing our eating our existing pie. What's the right solution? With board agreement, we decided to sell.
And so it became one of your 6 exits.
It did indeed become one of the 6 exits, the most recent one.
So Matt, let's get to the Qwist story, because I know that there is even more complexity and even more interesting things to discuss there.
Oh boy,
so
yeah.
Tell me about Qwist.
Qwist came about almost by chance. I was aware of open finance, open banking, but I think my perception of it was, this is a little bit it's a technology looking for applications and services and products that drive real value. I was a little skeptical about that because it's kind of like the early days of the mobile internet, where people talked about how big mobile internet was going to be. But until somebody came along with a device, in this case, the iPhone, that said, here's real things that you can do with it. And of course, now we don't talk about mobile internet. We talk about apps, we talk about services, we talk about being able to buy plane tickets, train tickets, having information, banking, all kinds of things on a device. Nobody talks about mobile internet. And my fear was that open finance and open banking was similar, that we were still at the stage when people, that was somewhat redolent of what was happening in mobile internet, when everybody said, well, next year mobile internet is going to be huge. But when I looked at it, the investors who had come up with an interesting thesis, they said, actually, we're at that stage on the Gartner curve, depending how you want to name it, where you've got that first initial phase where people jump into a market, get excited, and valuations go up, and you get some quite meaty valuations. But then you go inevitably to the point where people start saying, well, where does it go from here? And so typically you see those early adopters, and then it actually drops back a bit, the classic crossing the chasm book, that is a real thing. People jump onto a wave and then lots of people jump onto it. And then does it add real value? And so I got excited when I realized that we were probably at the start of that second, much more sustainable climb where you're starting to live a product market fit and people are understanding what they can do with the technology rather than what it is. And basically, the investors looked at the market and went, because it's, we've gone to the point where it's tricky to fund businesses that are not making money, tricky to fund anymore on promise of, hey, this is going to be big without a clear understanding of how. They were able to acquire two businesses, one called Qwist, one called Digit, which we then subsequently merged to create Qwist Group. We kept the names in the product suite so that we didn't throw away the heritage. Now this is ready to create a business that can be successful. It required, and still does require, a lot of change because you had one professional CEO, one founder CEO, very different skill sets. Both businesses were not doing terribly well commercially. They'd built great tech and they had great customers, but for different reasons were struggling to create value and grow those businesses. And one of them was because, I would say, a little bit too much focus on it's going to be big and not enough focus on the minutiae of, well, how? What are you going to do tomorrow that is going to make this business commercially successful because the market is growing, right? As opposed to just assuming that market growth is going to benefit the business. It's like, I always say, if there's a gold rush, the ideal place to be is somebody selling picks and shovels. So what are the picks and shovels? What are you going to sell and to whom that utilizes this technology and delivers real value as opposed to just powering it? The other side of the business was a classic founder CEO who couldn't really let go, who wanted to be in control of everything and couldn't bring people in and let them free, give them the ability to say, this is the direction in which the business needs to go. And so kept one of those CEOs, but moved that individual into a different position where they could utilize their strengths. The other CEO, we said, okay, please be an advisor to the business, but you need to step aside because you built a great product and you've actually hired some really good people and you've been very cost conscious and built an efficient organization. But you have become the brake on this business because you're not trusting people to do their jobs. Essentially, you're telling them how to do their jobs when they would be much better at it by themselves. You're not letting them free. So we said, okay, we're going to say goodbye, but we parted on very good terms, kept an advisory relationship. Obviously, they're still interested and motivated for the success of the business through equity. So that was a tricky one because you had two CEOs, both of whom were no longer CEOs, and both of whom I think thought that they would be and that they would run separate parts of the business. You can see two kinds of failure. You can see the situation where, okay, the founder CEO definitely is not going to cut it through the scale-up phase, and it's best for all concerned, and including them, if they walk away. But then you've got the other side where, absolutely that's completely the wrong decision because you bring in somebody who looks great on paper and has run a much bigger organization, but they don't understand the tactical involvement that they need to deploy to get over those humps. I think sometimes it's not working, and so it's tempting to go, okay, the problem is the CEO. They've done a great job. They've created a business, but now we need to bring somebody else in. That doesn't always work. Sometimes it does, but it very much depends who you bring in. And I think that tendency to bring in a big name with a very impressive CV running much larger organizations and assuming that they can get there is sometimes a mistake.
Yeah. So, Matt, if you were to sum up your advice to three different audiences, there are founder CEOs who are listening to us and they're running their own businesses and maybe trying to figure out how to stay as a CEO, how to live as a CEO, but they are founder CEOs. Then there are professional CEOs like you who take over from founders and take the business to the next level and possibly to an exit. And of course, investors, as you've mentioned, with their own ideas of who is the right person to run the company at every stage. What would you like each of these audiences to take away from this episode?
That's the $64,000 question, isn't it? So for me, for founders, I think it's actually the easiest, which is do not assume when somebody's telling you, okay, you've done a great job, but now you need to hand over. That is necessarily the case. You've got to take it instead as okay, your board is telling you that you don't, or they don't think you have all the skills needed to get your business to the next level. Now that's a tough message to take, right? But I would say to a founder CEO in that situation, don't assume that it's right, but do see if you can take a deep breath, drop the ego for a bit and look at it and go, okay, what do I need to know to go to the next stage? What skills, where am I not as good as I possibly think I am? I call it smart person's disease. And as late 20s something, I had that disease in spades. I thought that because I'd been successful, got to quite a high level at a young age, that I was brilliant at everything. It was a real shock to suddenly realize, actually, you know what? No, I'm not. There's lots of areas that I'm not good at. That realization is quite tough, right? If you've been the person on top of everything, which you have to be if you're a startup CEO and founder, swallow the ego for a bit, look at it and go, okay, can I hire into those roles and am I prepared to step back and listen? Or can I actually educate myself, accept that I'm not brilliant at it and do some work on it? Right? That would be my message to founder CEOs. Don't necessarily go, I need to exit. I've done it. The board's lost confidence. Sometimes the right decision is to leave, but frequently, if you've got the humility to say, actually, no, as some of the people that I know have done, said, hey, I was the founder CEO, but now I'm the chief product officer because I wanted to stay on the product side, but I've accepted that somebody else comes in as CEO, so I'm part of the senior exec team. Or you say, no, I'm going to stay as the CEO, but I'm not commercially skilled, so I'm going to bring in a CRO that knows how to do this. And I'm going to stay as the CEO. That would be my advice to CEOs. Just try and park the ego, accept you are not brilliant at everything and never will be, but that doesn't necessarily preclude you staying as long as you accept your own limitations and either address the limitations by improving yourself or address those limitations by bringing in a team around you. So that would be my advice to CEOs. Stop and think and try and park the ego before you make that decision.
Yeah.
I made a couple of decisions with ego in the past and they weren't my best decisions, to be quite candid. To professional CEOs, I would say, how do you keep the spark? I find myself asking myself that question frequently. It's like, okay, I'm taking something that has reached a certain point and has kind of got stuck or needs to take the next major step. And that requires some surgery, shall we say, to the business to make that happen. I can see what that is usually with a team. I'm not saying I can see it all by myself, but I'll get the right team in place. We'll look at the business in all areas and go, okay, how do we structure this business to be successful? I would say to my fellow professional CEOs, make sure you keep the spark or find a way to keep the spark. Or if you can, keep the founder CEO and make sure they are maybe the guardian of the heart and the drive and the dynamic of the company. That's the bit that sometimes gets lost. And then you lose that dynamic where the whole team is not just working for a company, they're believing in the mission. People talk vision and mission. And, I do too. And I try and instill one that is inspiring for people. But if you're a professional CEO, you're always going to struggle with that when compared with a founder CEO, who everybody knew has just, lived and breathed it right from the get-go, and the business wouldn't be there but for them. So think about that, I would say, as a professional CEO. For investors, I would say drop the cant and dogma. Look at the situation and say, it might be an easier solution. It might be quick, and the investment committee will like it, where you go, okay, this business is plateaued. It's actually declining a little bit now. It's going wrong. Okay, what do we do? Let's kick out the CEO and bring in somebody else who can turn it around, quote unquote. I would say think very carefully, think long and hard before you do that. It's something that is a bit of a tendency to just say, okay, that solves the problem. But it frequently doesn't, and it creates problems. Ask yourself the question, do you have to have a tough conversation that says, well, maybe you're not the CEO anymore and you step into a different role, but also maybe you say, okay, we're going to be a bit more prescriptive, and we're going to say, hey, you're still CEO, but we're going to appoint a CRO, or we're going to appoint a CTO, or we're going to appoint a new CFO, and take your advice, but we're going to force that through because we know what the business needs, and that will make you successful. Okay. And that's a harder thing to do because it's easier to just switch the CEO and say to the new CEO, you make all those changes. But then you lose that spark frequently. I would say to investors, don't just go with the obvious, okay, this person has reached the limit of their capability, because actually they probably haven't if you invest in training them and developing them and forcing them to make some tough decisions that they don't want to make. They founded the business with their co-founder. The co-founder clearly is no longer contributing to that business, and it's best for all concerned if they're the ones that exit, but they don't want to do that because it's a good friend, they've started the business together. I think you've got to make sure as an investor that you're taking the time to really understand that individual and their potential capabilities, so you don't just go, hey, let's scoot them out.
Yeah. And Matt, as we're preparing to start wrapping up our conversation, what else would you like to share with our listeners on the topic of CEO succession, leadership transitions, and everything we've discussed in startups?
I think the number one thing I'd share is think about how you manage yourself. If you're going to step into a business, okay, there will be people that don't like what you're doing. There will be tough choices to make. There will be need to get people to work together in ways that they would rather not. And it's very easy to let that get on top of you. It's also very easy to then deal with that by saying, okay, I'm going to be the hard-nosed, unfeeling individual. So my perspective on that is you've got to find a way to find the resilience to deal with the fact that you're making decisions that people don't like, but also stay connected, stay human, because people can't connect with somebody that's not human, right? You could do all the right things at a logical level, strategically and tactically, but you won't get an organization behind you unless they feel that you're a real person that they can still connect with, right? So they've got to respect you, but they've got to understand that you're a human being as well, and you've got to find a way to keep the right degree of separation so that you can make the tough decisions, but also that you can connect with people. But there's still somebody that I can trust, that I can build a team with, because ultimately it's people, product, and market. The fundamental triage of business is people, product, and market, and people come first. So it's easy to, I think, sometimes forget that that's really, really a critical part of being a leader, that ultimately people have to have a real person to connect with, not some kind of role that you're playing. And that's a tricky one. It's something I've struggled with, to be honest, especially when I was younger. I thought CEOs behaved in a certain way, so I behaved in that way. And it was after some coaching, actually, where I said, look, I'm struggling to feel like I really connect with people and that they're doing what I want them to do, but I don't feel like they necessarily want to do it. They're not bought in. We're not gelling. And the coach said to me, he said, well, you do realize they've never met Matt. And I went, what? What do you mean they've never met Matt? I said, you're not Matt, right? You were honest about it, right? The way that you interact with in a social environment and with friends and family is totally different. Now, of course, we don't behave the same way in our social and private lives as we do in our business lives. But if we are a completely different person, if we're just playing a role, then people struggle to connect with you, right? Because you're not a real person. So, and I'm speaking very personally, maybe other people haven't had to go through that journey because they're more naturally empathic. But, I was forced earlier on in my career to sort of really understand what I was good at and what I wasn't so good at. I could actually open up to people a lot more and be more, use that horrible word, real, be myself to a greater degree, and that wasn't going to create a problem. In fact, it was going to create much more positive environment because people started understanding, yes, this is a real person. And it suddenly opens up, for me at least, the opportunity to say, and you might want to bleep this, but the ability to say, I fucked up. And as a CEO, the ability to say that is so incredibly powerful because people suddenly go, you don't have all the answers and nobody does. It doesn't make you useless to make a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes. Everybody makes decisions with the best of intent and possibly even based on the data that they had at the time, which was incomplete. You would have made the same decision again. It turns out that didn't work out. Something happened in the market that you couldn't have known about, scuppers that, right? It's so powerful to be able to look people in the eye and go, look, I'm going to trust you because yes, you will make mistakes, but so will I, right? The trick is that we really own up to it and have the courage to say, yeah, guys, really sorry. That one didn't work out. I got it wrong. And that does two things, right? It does make you a real human being because real human beings make mistakes. It also, in terms of dealing with your own ego, is incredibly powerful because it allows you to go, okay, I am pretty good at what I do, but it doesn't make me infallible. It doesn't mean I'm always right. And therefore I've got that strength of character that says, okay, damn, I got it wrong, but it's not going to kill me.
Yeah, it's just a mistake we can learn from and move forward. Matt, thank you so much for this conversation. There are so many gems here and we covered so much ground discussing your experience, but it's not often that I speak to people with decades of experience in the business, 6 exits, starting with an AI company in the 90s and still being actively involved, not retiring, but building new companies and moving them forward.
Yeah. No, it's what I love doing. I'm a competitive team player. So for me, business is the ultimate team game and I love it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To wrap up our conversation today, I would like to highlight a couple of points. The first one is Matt's insistence that stepping down is not the only way forward as the company starts to grow. There is a narrative that as the business changes, the skills of the CEO also evolve to an extent that it starts making sense to bring in a professional chief executive. But this is not the only way. Even if the CEO doesn't have all the skills required, it's absolutely fine to hire around them to complement the skill set and make sure that the chief executive, the founder, can rely on an experienced senior team to keep scaling the business. And this message also applies to investors who are sometimes a little bit too eager to bring in an external talent, hoping to address some performance issue in the business, forgetting that founders can complement the deficiencies in their skill set, but they bring so much to the table. Founders have the vision, the original magic, the gravitas that comes with just founding the business. And professional CEOs, even as experienced as and talented as Matt, know that it's a very important factor for the success of the entire business. I hope you found our conversation interesting and useful. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and speak to you soon.